child labor and human rights violations in the mining industry of the Democratic Republic of Congo will come to order. In 2009, Adam Hochschild wrote a book which so shocked the conscience, telling the story of how greed could justify the worst exploitation of one's fellow human beings. That book, King Leopold's Ghost, tells of the raping and ravaging of the resources of what was then called, ironically enough, the Congo Free State. In reality, it was the personal preserve of just one man, King Leopold II of Belgium, though he never visited during his reign. As one surveys the history of Western colonialization in Africa, there was probably no more brutal experience than that happened in King Leopold's Congo, which eventually was annexed by Belgium and later became what we know as the Independent Democratic Republic of Congo, or DRC, though it was called Zaire for many of my early years in the U.S. Congress. In the case of Leopold's Congo, it was the unquenchable quest for rubber which ignited the greed of men. The brutality, as told by Hochschild, was driven home by photos of several hands that appear in his book and the hapless amputees. And as land was claimed for rubber plantations, the men of villages that did not submit were often killed. Hands were collected from corpses to demonstrate to Belgian overseers that bullets were not wasted or to collect bounties. That, in turn, incentivized the severing of hands of those who still living up to the tally, leaving amputees with lives forever intentionally crippled. I was reminded of these photos in preparation for today's hearing as I saw a photo of a Congolese child without a leg in a submission for the record of today's hearing by the International Rights Advocates. That child lost his leg in an artisanal mine in the Democratic Republic of Congo, which brings us directly to the topic of today's hearing. For just as rubber once motivated the greed of men, today it is the quest for cobalt, for batteries, and lithium for solar panels to power the so-called green economy that motivates human rapacity. Today's hearing will focus on the mining industry of the DRC, and most importantly, its exploited victims. The DRC is a resource-rich and governance-poor country. 70% of the world's mining of cobalt, constituting a major part of the global supply chain, occurs within the DRC, and an estimated 40,000 children toil in non-regulated artisanal mines under hazardous conditions. These mines are often no more than narrow shafts dug into the ground, which is why children are so often recruited, and in many cases forced to descend into them using only their hands or rudimentary tools without any protective equipment to extract cobalt and other minerals. These hastily dug artisanal mines are also subject to collapsing, which is why we see photos of children with amputated legs. These are the lucky ones who escaped from a collapsed mine with their lives, but not with their limbs. But it is not only in artisanal mines where safety standards are not met and environmental impact disregarded, but the mining sector as a whole. Many Congolese mines are owned by the Chinese firms like China Molybdenum. Indeed, the Chinese presence, and to a lesser but still significant extent, the Russian one, can be seen throughout Africa, particularly in the mining industry. For China has a strategic interest in controlling the global supply chain of cobalt, as it does rare earth minerals with military applications. Sometimes that's for far too long. Successive U.S. administrations have ignored, as one of our witnesses, former Ambassador Eric Schultz, will amplify upon. Indeed, no U.S. president since George W. Bush, whose PEPFAR plan to combat AIDS positively transformed the lives of so many African individuals and families, has shown a real interest in either the strategic importance or humanitarian needs of Africa. That is an indictment, I would suggest, on both successive Democratic and Republican administrations. And it is in the DRC where we see the effects of that neglect play out. Into that vacuum, others have stepped in, and so often for ill. In eastern DRC, where Rwanda and Uganda are competing for leverage, and a revived M23 movement is fomenting civil conflict, Islamic groups like ADF, which pledges allegiance to ISIS, are also active. In eastern DRC, it is the Congolese state appears almost hapless and unable to meet the basic needs of governance. But what makes the mining industry different is that we see the complicity of corrupt government officials in inviting outside actors to exploit the Congo. This corruption is alleged to go to the very top, to President Tshisekedi and his family. Officials overlook illegal Chinese smelters that straddle the national road near Likasi and Kolwezi. This processed ore is then often smuggled untaxed through Zambia, which further deprives the state and the Congolese people of revenue that they would otherwise be able to benefit from. I would like to submit for the record a non-paper anonymously drafted to protect the author's identity as part of the record, which addresses this and some of the related issues. And without objection, it is so ordered. Before closing, I want to address what is that the United States and the Congress can do much more to address the manifest problems of the DRC, from human rights and humanitarian concerns on the issue of corruption, especially as the elections in 2023 approach. We do know, based on reporting by independent observers, including the Catholic Church, that the 2018 election, which brought Tshisekedi to the presidency, was marked by fraud. Yet, at this critical time, as China and Russia spread their malign influence, the United States' presence is strangely muted in the region. Our current ambassador to the DRC, Mike Hammer, has been nominated as the special envoy to the Horn of Africa and will be leaving. No special envoy to the Great Lakes has been appointed, and no ambassador-level representation in Rwanda, which is alleged to be supporting the M23 guerrilla in the movements in eastern DRC. The DRC is far too critical and its people far too precious for us to be absent. It is my hope that this hearing will spur both Congress and the administration to pay greater attention to the DRC. You know, just for the record, over the years, I have chaired many hearings on Africa as chairman of the Africa Global Health Human Rights Committee. And even this morning, my good friend and colleague, Karen Bass, chaired a hearing on Russia's malign influence on Africa. It was a tremendous hearing. But I have traveled to DRC. I have traveled to Goma. One of the issues that brought me there was when the peacekeepers were abusing little kids as young as 13, 12, 11 for a loaf of bread to provide trafficking services to the peacekeepers. I held 4 hearings on that issue and actually made sure that the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, which I'm the prime author of, ensured that military organizations, whether it be UN peacekeepers or the actual military of any individual country, are also looked at very carefully and scrutinized by the TIP office, and it becomes part of the narrative per country on protection, prevention, and prosecution. And I'll never forget, we had Jane Hall Lutz sit right where you're sitting, Mr. Ambassador, who was trying her level best at the United Nations to get that deployment to come forward with who are these people committing these crimes against the people they were designed to protect. And one of the hearings I named, zero tolerance, and Kofi Annan did put out a zero tolerance policy, but it was zero compliance that we actually were seeing. There have been changes made since, but it just underscored to me and to so many others, how awful these people, these wonderful people, have been treated for far too long. So I thank you, all of our distinguished witnesses, for being here, and I'd like to now welcome you and ask you if you would provide your testimony to the Lantos Commission. We will begin with Hervé de Kaseye Kiyungu, who is a native of the Democratic Republic of Congo. He's an attorney specializing in alternative dispute resolution and is a prominent DRC human rights activist. He has built a reputation protecting children and vulnerable individuals, as well as fighting against corruption. Before Congolese courts, he has represented individuals who are victims of illegal money withdrawals by Congolese telecommunications companies. In addition, he has served as Deputy Chief of Staff at the Constitutional Court, where he oversaw and coordinated constitutional litigation proceedings. He served as legal representatives before the International Criminal Court for child soldier victims from the Ituri conflict, where he played a crucial role in exposing how predatory networks and armed groups prey on children as young as 7, leading to serious physical and emotional abuse. Prior to that, he served as a consultant trainer at the Carter Center in the DRC, where he led workshops on the role of civil society organizations and the media in the democratic governance of political institutions, as well as electoral reforms. As an expert in negotiations and mediation, he currently serves as a member of the board of directors of the International Conference on Judicial Mediation. He also received his law degree from Congo University. I'd like to comment for the record how incredibly grateful this commission is for your participation in today's hearing. You have sacrificed a tremendous amount to testify today, and the U.S. Congress is committed to you and to your family's safety. We will now hear from Ambassador Eric Schultz, who is a former senior American diplomat with decades of experience in the countries of the Commonwealth of Independent States and Southern Africa. He most recently served as U.S. Ambassador to Zambia from 2014 to 2017, and his testimony, which I greatly enjoyed reading, draws upon his experience as ambassador and compares this experience to the developments in the DRC. As you will hear later, Ambassador Schultz expertly points out that the PRC's goal is to control all key resources in the future and to create a dependent relationship in Africa. He notes that governments become indebted to the PRC contractors and to the officials. Zambia, like many other African nations, do not reap the benefits of Chinese projects and are instead coerced and stuck in this manipulation and forceful link. Prior to Ambassador Schultz posting in Zambia, he served as Deputy U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine, the Minister of Consular of Economic Affairs at the U.S. Embassy in Moscow, and Deputy U.S. Ambassador to Zimbabwe. Ambassador Schultz also played a crucial role in maintaining relations with NATO and the Organization for Security Cooperation in Europe in his posting as Deputy Director of the State Department's Office of European Security and Political Affairs. Ambassador Schultz also held assignments in Turkmenistan and Georgia. He received his MA in International Studies from Denver University. Then we'll hear from Father Rigobert Menani Behuzo, who's a Congolese Jesuit priest and currently the head of Research, Peace, Human Rights, Democracy, and Good Governance at the Research Center for Social Action for the Democratic Republic of Congo, or CPAS, where he leads efforts to ensure the link between study and social work according to the mission of the Central African Province of the Society of Jesus. He is also regional coordinator of the Ecclesial Network of the Congo Basin Forest, or REBOC, a sub-regional African office which draws on Pope Francis's encouragement of biodiverse lungs of the Amazon and Congo basins. As a spiritual leader and human rights advocate, Father Menani plays a crucial role in collaboration between faith-based organizations and civil society, as you will hear in his testimony, which we will be getting by way of computer. And Father Menani offers valuable insight on interfaith collaboration on human rights matters. He works on artisanal mining in the provisions of South Kivu, Bunia, and Ituri. His first-hand observations offer critical insight on the structural changes needed to stop child labor. I've read his testimony. It is outstanding, and to improve human rights. He received his PhD in social sciences and economics from Catholic University of Paris, an advanced degree in political science, and an MA in theology in Montreal. Then we'll hear from Sasha let me get this right, Lesnev, thank you, who's a policy consultant at the Sentry, an investigative and policy organization that seeks to expose grand corruption and unchecked greed in order to disable multinational predatory networks that benefit from violent conflict, repression, and kleptocracy. In 2016, the Sentry was founded by George Clooney and John Pendergrass, and John Pendergrass has been a frequent witness at our hearings. We have learned so much from him on Sudan and so many other issues. And Sasha, too, of course. And we do thank you for that in the past, to advise government, banks, and armed groups and state forces that take place plays part of it of illicit financial flows that fuel armed groups and state forces. As you will hear from his testimony on how automobile and tech companies, as well as the U.S. government, can harmonize efforts to stop this horrific abuse. He is the founding director of the Grassroots Reconciliation Group, an organization that helps rehabilitate former child soldiers. He is on the leadership board of Resolve, an NGO that brings together collaborative leaders to create innovative solutions. And he is founding director of the Grassroots Reconciliation Group, an organization to rehabilitate child soldiers and refugees. Previously, Mr. Lezened was director of policy at the Enough Project and policy advisor at Global Witness. Prior to that, he worked extensively in Uganda under a USAID contract with regard to Northern Uganda Peace Initiative, and was a peace process advisor to and a Northern Uganda mediator. He is the author of the book, Crafting Peace, Strategies to Deal with Warlords in Collapsing States. He holds a master's in international relations from Cambridge and a BS in foreign service from Georgetown University. Then we'll hear from Ida Sawyer, who is currently the Crisis and Conflict Director of Human Rights Watch. Previously, she served as Deputy Director of the Africa Division of Human Rights Watch from 2018 until early 2022, where she led human rights efforts in approximately 25 countries in sub-Saharan Africa. She has been a public policy fellow at Woodrow Wilson International Center and focused her research and pro-democracy advocacy in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Prior to that role, she served as Human Rights Watch's acting crisis and conflict director, where she supported a team of researchers in responding to global crises, some of which included Russian and Syrian strikes on civilian infrastructure in northwest Syria and obstruction in Yemen. Ms. Sawyer is an expert in Central Africa, given she has previously was Human Rights Central African Director, where she oversaw work on the Republic of Congo, Rwanda, Burundi, and the Central African Republic. From speaking up courageously against human rights violations and publishing several reports, she was barred by Congolese authorities from entering the country. She got her master's degree in international affairs and specializing in human rights from Columbia University. I'd like to thank you again. We were joined by Jim? Okay. Co-chair Jim McGovern hopefully will be joining us at some time in the very near future, but he is on the floor casting a vote on some important bills. I thank you, and we'd like to go to you if you would.
Thank you, sir. Child labor is one of the worst forms of abuse. It is forbidden by both Congolese legislation as well as international rules and law. In the mining industry in my country, the Democratic Republic of Congo, children are often exposed to radioactive minerals, injuries, deadly and painful disease. For example, with respect to the extraction of cobalt in artisanal mines within the Lualaba province, children are routinely used as part of the workforce. They are unremunerated and exploited, and the work is often fatal, as the children are required to crawl into small holes dug in the earth to recover sacks of ore containing rich grades of heterogeneous, which is almost 60% of cobalt. These children are not going to school. Their health is exposed as they are living in precarious conditions. In the Kasulo deposit, for example, children collect cobalt ore in the holes mentioned above. They are required to clean the ore before selling it to the intermediaries. The Kasulo deposit is currently owned by Dongfang Congo Mining, DFM, a Chinese company. Officially, artisanal mines are supposed to be owned by Congolese citizens, working in what they call cooperative. In reality, they are selling the product extracted from these to Chinese and others foreigners, such as Pakistanis or Indians. The vast majority of this whole, however, is trafficking through Chinese intermediaries. Moreover, Chinese are not waiting to be delivered the product of these extraction from artisanal mines, but are currently on the field on open pit mines, overseeing the operations, where children are exploited and are the one fixing the prices. In July 2021, in Commerce Concession, a Chinese company, two persons identified as Chinese citizens have instructed two Congolese soldiers, militaries, officers, to whip two Congolese who were found on their site. The scene was recorded and posted into the internet. The video demonstrates the connection between Chinese companies and Congolese authorities, giving to them military protection and the authority to instruct to military to whip Congolese citizens with total impunity. The mineral extracted from these mines are sold and exported through the major mining companies, mainly operating in the Lualaba province, formerly the mining sector of the Katanga province, among them Chinese and Russians. The challenge to address these critical issues is that these mining companies are linked with high-ranked officials and authorities, among them members of the presidential family. This has been documented, but is thinly veiled secret in the DRC. Minerals can only be exported by companies which are duly registered and have license for this. No one of the artisanal mines where children are part of labor have been granted such proper licenses for such activity. This shame allows company to under-declare the quantity of cobalt extracted while being exported from the Congo, thus reducing the amount of tax and royalties paid to the government. Since most of these operations are illegal, these methods completely hide the transaction. However, while crossing the border at the country of transit, like Tanzania and Zambia, at the foreign border, they are under obligation to declare the actual quantity being exported. I think the Zambia authority will always show far more cobalt exported than is declared on the DRC side to these sleight of hand and corruptions. There is difference between the quantity effectively extracted in the Congo and the actual quantity exported, which demonstrated that there is a certain quantity coming from untraceable sources. Therefore, the extra quantity is extracted from artisanal mines, where children are being exploited. As artisanal mines do not have license and structure for exportation. This situation is one reflecting the wide aspect of the vast corruption in my country. The president and ruling political coalition called Union Sacrée are controlling the Senate and National Assembly. President Tshisekedi has recently ordered cars for certain legislators without any traceability in the official budgets. This corruption obviously serves to control these officials and encourage them to vote in the president's interest. Free and fair elections are another issue. The current administration has completely relinquished their obligation and duty as lawmakers on deciding whether there will be electronic votes and have left it to the Electoral Commission, the national election authority responsible for organizing and carrying out elections, to decide. The CENI was clearly under the control of former President Kabila, which led to unfair elections in 2018. CENI continues to be under control of the actual President Tshisekedi and his allies. The electronic votes will once again endanger the election in the Congo and will allow manipulation of the results without any way of control. This is the greatest fear of the population. We need and deserve free and fair elections. Members of the Electoral Commission, even those who were supposed to be from the opposition, were appointed following an illegitimate process and without the consent of their political party. So they are controlled completely by President Tshisekedi. Furthermore, the CENI's president, who was appointed after a controversial process has been denounced by the Catholic Church for corruption. The Constitutional Court, the most prominent court of justice in the country, and the one who will decide about the final result of election, is also controlled by the president and his allies. They've removed, through a controversial process, the former president, Dieudonné Kaluba, and have appointed a new president, Kamuleta Badibanga, who was elected as new president. Both the former and the newcomer are from the same ethnical group as the President Tshisekedi and under his control. Unfortunately, tribal issues still create divisions in my country. As of now, institutions playing crucial role on the electoral process are led by authority almost exclusively from President Tshisekedi's ethnic group. He has not opened up his administration to a wide representation, which throw into question the credibility of upcoming free and fair election. Furthermore, this runs the risk of ethnic resentment, which could lead to greater conflict and tension during the elections, with an important risk of major escalation of this situation and civil unrest. The people must trust the results, and currently the situation is untrustworthy. Despite the president's public speech against corruption, it is obvious that things are worsening on the ground. The public proclamation regarding the fight against corruption, like what they call trial of 100 jours, has been a failure. Even a judge died suspectedly during that period. Even prosecuted officials who have been deemed guilty have now been set free if they are on the right party. One of them, the former educational minister, Willy Bakonga, who was condemned for 3 years of prison, but he's illegally liberated and now sits in parliament. There are countless other examples that can be used to illustrate that point. The fraud perpetrated against the state is in the hundreds of millions. Recently, these authorities have initiated a new taxation on telecommunication companies who are claiming to have no other option than to increase costs of access to their service to the consumer. It is obvious that there is a corrupted system that is benefiting high-ranking politicians in power by using all their influence to get more money, to protect their position, and to remain in power. Elections that are not free and fair will only perpetuate these corruptions. It's often said that the Congo is a country of immense potential. Until we can ensure a fair and democratic process, that potential will never be achieved. And you can help my country, my people, to stop that. Since our children, they are dying in mining resources that could help their future. Thank you.
All right, thank you so very much for that very moving testimony, for flying here to make this presentation in person. I deeply appreciate that as well. We'll have some questions at the end of all of our panelists, but I can't thank you enough for bearing witness to this incredibly ugly truth and the fact that we need to do more. Ambassador Schultz.
Correct. Mr. Chairman, thank you very much for the invitation to speak today. I didn't work in the DRC, as you noted in my bio, but rather in neighboring Zambia. That said, the two countries share a lot of similar characteristics, in particular a heavy reliance on mining, and especially copper mining and cobalt to a certain extent as well. The story of China, which is what I was kind of asked to testify on today, in this part of Africa is really a story about copper and cobalt and other natural resources. Copper in particular, but cobalt also, is one of the key building blocks of the new global economy. You called it the green economy in your opening comments. Electric vehicles, for instance, require copper for their wiring, and Zambia and the DRC, which share the same copper fields in the copper belt of northern Zambia and southern DRC, are among the most important producers of copper globally. Zambia's first president, Kenneth Kaunda, known as KK, whom I met a number of times before his recent passing, once said that Zambia was born with a copper spoon in its mouth, which I think is kind of an indication of just how rich the copper deposits were, and I guess still are. And Chinese control of these deposits gives them a leg up in the struggle to control the new economy. When I worked in Zambia as the U.S. ambassador from 2014 to 2017, we used to say that Zambia was ground zero for China's policy in Africa. China was ubiquitous in Zambia. Chinese businesses, especially construction companies, were everywhere. The Patriotic Front government, which took over in 2011, ironically after running an anti-Chinese electoral campaign, worked hand in glove with the Chinese on their signature road program. 100% of the roads were actually built by Chinese companies. The government and its supporters took great pride in the road program, which they claimed was opening the whole of the country for business. The Zambian people were themselves a bit less impressed. They used to refer to Chinese roads as having been painted on because they didn't actually last past the first rainy season. The number of Chinese citizens living in Zambia was estimated by the Chinese embassy itself in 2016 at 140,000 people. That's from basically zero 20 years earlier, making them by far the largest ethnic minority in the country. Many of them were demobilized Chinese construction workers. One of my Zambian friends used to call them construction workers by day and poachers by night. Anyway, many of them find themselves working and competing side by side with Zambians in the country's marketplaces. The Chinese supported the PF government with campaign funds, with information about the opposition gleaned from cell phone networks run by Howie. I have no idea. And most of all with project funds. The Chinese do not compete directly with the US or the EU or the IMF. They don't provide budget support. They provide project loans, and they provided Zambia with more than $10 billion during PF's rule from 2011 to 2021. That 10 billion is roughly 50% of the country's GDP. It's an enormous figure for Zambia. And I think it's important to note that China doesn't forgive loans. So this huge debt burden is something that is likely to persist for some time. By contrast, the US was part of the initiative to forgive the debts of highly indebted poor countries, from which Zambia benefited greatly. In fact, in 2011, when the PF took power, Zambia had virtually no debt. The bulk of US assistance, again in contrast to China, has been healthcare grants, especially PEPFAR. The US has given over $500 million a year to Zambia since PEPFAR started in 2007. PEPFAR assistance throughout Africa doesn't need to be repaid, and it has saved the lives of millions of Africans. China's policy toward Africa in general and toward Zambia in particular was, and still is, I would argue, to create a dependent relationship. They offer carrots like project loans, usually with inducements for government officials. By way of example, the new Lusaka International Airport, begun while I was in Zambia and completed in 2020, is something of a case study in how China operates in Africa. First of all, it is arguable that whether Zambia actually needed a new airport, given the low volume of traffic. It was the Chinese who proposed the airport to the Zambian government, as in fact they did with virtually all the projects that China financed in Zambia. Zambian businessmen who were interested in competing for the tender estimated the cost of the project at $100 million, 1/3 for materials, 1/3 for labor, 1/3 for profit. In the end, only Chinese companies were allowed to compete since China was financing the project, also standard practice. And the cost of the project came in at $360 million, $30 million for materials, $30 million for labor, and $300 million for profit. The profit was shared unequally between the Chinese contractors and PF officials. All of it, however, went on the country's credit card and became part of that $10 billion in debt that Zambia and its new government owe China. The fact that everything involved in Chinese finance projects was Chinese also meant that the multiplier effect on Zambia's economy was all but non-existent, since no Zambian companies were involved, no Zambian workers were involved, et cetera. I said at the beginning that Zambia was ground zero for China and Africa, but I would bet that if you polled my colleagues at the time, many, if not most, of the other ambassadors would say the same thing about their countries. China uses the same approach in every African country, fueling authoritarianism, corruption, and economic inefficiency. And there are multiple instances of China leveraging its creditor status to take control of African, and not only African, economic assets, such as the Entebbe Airport, their efforts to build military bases in Equatorial Guinea, and obviously in the news lately, the whole thing in Sri Lanka where they took control of a port that they had built. At the time I was in Zambia, the USG believed that we were not in direct competition with China, that if the Chinese were prepared to invest tens of billions of dollars into Africa, while American companies sat on the sidelines, who are we to complain? But it isn't a fair fight. If the USG were prepared to subsidize US investment in Africa to the same extent the Chinese do, I believe there would be many, many more American companies in Africa. And the Chinese goal, again, is to control key resources for the future and to shut the US, frankly, out of the game. In that regard, I'd add, The Chinese are not fans of the new Zambian president, Hakainde Hichilema. They heavily backed the former president, Edgar Lungu, including, as I said earlier, with financial support. HH, as he is called, was a shock to the Chinese. They didn't think he would win, and he represents all the things China has fought against in Africa: democracy, transparency, and market economics. I'll close by saying that I think we are, in a very real sense, in a sort of war with China in Africa, and Russia too, for that matter. Or rather, they are at war with us. And Africa is too important, I believe, for the US to not fight back. And I'll just close by noting that Secretary Yellen in Bali yesterday was quoted as saying she's going to start pushing the Chinese to help to reduce the unsustainable debt burden for countries in Africa and others that are subject to China. It's time for something like that. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your leadership, your career, and for taking the time out to share these thoughts with us. And I'd like to now turn to Father Menani, who will be coming in online. Father?
Thank you very much to invite me to address this distinguished audience. I'm speaking from Kinshasa. Hope that you can hear me.
Yes, we can hear you. Oh, there you are. Thank you, and see you.
Okay. The situation in the Democratic Republic of the Congo today regarding child labor and human rights violation is very critical. The number of artisanal miners and small-scale minings from Ituri to the Lake Tanganyika is estimated to 1,000, and miners themselves to more than 200,000 people, among them thousands of children and pregnant women. The Catholic Church social doctrine condemns all forms of exploitation of children. I quote, "This exploitation represents a serious violation of human dignity. It is necessary for people in the process of reforming the system to give democracy an authentic and solid foundation through the explicit recognition of human rights." Among the most important of these rights, the Catholic Church insists on the right of a child to live and grow in an environment conducive to its full development. The Church recognizes also the right of every human being to work and be able to support oneself and one's dependents. It promotes the duty of everybody to make wise use of Earth's natural and mineral resources. The National Episcopal Conference of the Congo, SENCO, has always been at the forefront of social and political engagement. In numerous pastoral letters, it has pointed out a clear link that exists between democracy and good governance of natural and mineral resources. This report will build on some aspect of SENCO work. For more than 25 years now, Central Africa experts, including diplomats, researchers, NGOs, and journalists, has identified the looting of mineral resources in DRC as a structural cause of the endless conflict in the eastern part of the Congo. The impact of extractive industry on the conflict has been the DRC Church major concern since early 2000. In July 2007, SENCO decided to create the Episcopal Commission of Natural Resources, CERN. This commission established natural resources observatories in dioceses that document and denounce cases of human rights violations, including corruption and environmental damages from mining. The report we are sharing has been conducted with 10 observatories in 2 regions in the eastern part of the Congo. Last year, 3 institutions, the Ecclesial Network of the Congo Basin Forest Rebac, the Jesuit Center of Studies and Social Action, CEPAS, and the Episcopal Commission of Natural Resources, conducted field research on the working conditions in artisanal mining through the lens of human rights norms. We decided to focus our research on artisanal mining because this sector, compared to industrial mining, provide income to highest number of workers in mining business. But this sector is also one of the worst in the term of human rights standards. We also decided to focus our research on gold exploitation because according to studies, more than 90% of DRC artisan gold is reported to be informal or illegal mining, and between 95 to 98 is estimated to be smuggled out of the country through the eastern neighbors states. The field research was conducted in two regions, Uvira in South Kivu and Ituri and Bunia in Ituri. As research methodology, we targeted stakeholders of artisan mining and small-scale mining, and for each territory, 10 focus groups of 10 people each of different ages and gender were organized. The investigation was about the link between working conditions of artisanal miners and the respect of human rights. Our research selected 6 categories of actors involved in this business: the owner of the mines, the miners themselves, the administrators of the sites, the head of cooperatives, the traders, and gold counters. This statement is organized around 10 chosen variables directly linked to human rights. First, child labor. All field survey reports deplore the fact that the majority of mines use children in various tasks. This is done while Congolese legislations and international standards prohibit child labor. Reports indicate that children, male and female, who initially come to the mining to obtain money for their schooling, end up dropping the school, and most of them will stay permanently in the mines. Second, workplace. The majority of artisanal mining is done in forests and other inaccessible places. Travel conditions between the nearest towns and these mines are dangerous. Male children who want to work in the mines lose their lives even before arriving in the mining sites. Third, working conditions. Our report noted that artisan miners are not provided with any protection equipment. They work 7 days a week and more than 12 hours a day. In reality, their working hours are not defined. It includes weekends and holidays. They are exposed to radiation from the product they use and the danger of explosive they use. Work tools. Physical force labor is the main mean of work of miners. They use rudimentary instruments, namely pneumatic drill, hammer, chisel, spades, and crowbars. This work harms the health of the workers and significantly reduce their life expectancy. Their working conditions are like that of slavery. Medical insurance. No medical insurance is offered to workers. Hard manual labor is cause of big injuries. Dispensaries around the mining sites lack medicine and even minimum equipment. Basic care is inaccessible to the majority of them, who dies due to their various untreated illness. Financial income. Despite the hard work of artisanal miners, what they earn does not allow them to cover their basic human rights. They are poorly housed, poorly fed, poorly cared for, and unable to care for their family expenses. Administrative and police hassle. Many mining sites are owned by military and political administrative authorities who often mistreat workers. Faced with such power masters, miners do not know how to claim. Danger of armed group. This survey was conducted in an area where various armed groups are active. Some devoted themselves to the artisanal exploitation of gold to finance their activities. Others attack artisanal miners to confiscate their hard-earned products. In the absence of local government, rule of law, in these remote and isolated areas, artisanal workers are at the mercy of this group. Many lose their lives, others are molested and injured, and often lose their property. Forced eviction. Many small mining are located in concession close to big industrial minings. At regular intervals, they are forced to leave their places of exploitation. This does not only concern operators of mine, but also affect villages. Whenever big companies identify areas with a high concentration of gold, they force people to move and to leave the villages. Administrative hassles. What little state administration exists in this remote area often makes little impossible for artisan miners. They are subject to arbitrary taxes, not recognized by legal structures of tax. Several kinds of tax are imposed, such as mining service, police tax, migration tax, environmental tax, and so on. Illegal tax operations are found in these mines, and artisans do not know where to turn there to address them. Conclusion and recommendation. Structural changes are needed to stop child labor and improve human rights conditions in mining sector in DRC. Our field survey have helped to identify a number of priorities in artisanal mining. This sector needs legal, technical, and organizational assistance to improve the living conditions of miners and their family. Special attention should be given to children living in mining sites. There is need to promote a program of race awareness and offer support to children and pregnant women in activities other than mining. Special school programs and vocational training schools are needed in this place. Family microcredit could improve families' access to food, water, and medicine. Equipped health structures close to mining sites and guarantee access to healthcare for artisan miners workers are urgent need. Miners need support to integrate the culture of saving and investing in other activities different from gold, like farming. Miners should be provided with personal protective equipment, glove, mask, helmet, and appropriate tools for work. The legislation should monitor the use of mercury and chemical and explosive in artisanal mining. Traders we interviewed had confirmed that gold mined in DRC is mostly transported illegally to neighbor countries, Rwanda, Uganda, and Burundi, before being exported to countries such as Switzerland and United Arab Emirates. From there, it is sold to the end market, mainly in the European Union, the US, and China. It is this business that is still fueling war in the region. The link between illegal mining and conflict in the eastern part of the Congo need to be addressed. Finally, the rigged elections of 2018 continue to undermine the country. 1 year before the next election, we are still uncertain about the coming elections. Effort needs to be deployed to guarantee that next year elections are free, fair, and inclusive. To end labor and human rights violation at artisanal and small mining, DRC needs a functional state that can put all the recommendation, this recommendation in action. Today, I should recognize we are very far from this. Thank you very much.
Father, thank you so very much for your testimony and for your leadership. I'd like to now yield to Mr. Lesnev. Much time as he may consume.
Thank you so much, Congressman Smith and McGovern and members of the commission for really drawing attention to this very important issue of child minors and corruption in the Congolese mining sector, something I've seen myself dozens of times on trips to mines in the DRC. I'm going to focus today on one mineral, cobalt, which is used in our electric vehicles, on our smartphones and laptops, and focus on supply chains and offer four main ideas to help tackle the problem. While child minors are stains on our conscience, there is important momentum to build on to address the issue. Number one, cobalt supply chains are actually relatively short and simple when compared with other minerals. There are only 50 to 80 viable mines. They're all in one country, basically in one region. There are only about 75 major cobalt smelters, which is a key choke point in mineral supply chains worldwide. And although Chinese companies are attempting to break off as an independent group, the reality is that U.S. automotive and electronics companies still have very significant leverage on this supply chain, which they have shown exercised on other minerals, if they use their combined buying power and focus, particularly with Chinese companies. There's also been some progress in reducing child labor at pilot mine sites. So if any supply chain issue is solvable, it is this one. And key lessons can be drawn from the fight against conflict minerals, which Congress has played a leading role on. The U.S. government has also taken some important steps to combat corruption in the DRC, following important congressional encouragement, including from yourselves. So there is important building blocks to work on. The bad news, as several of the other witnesses have highlighted, is that the window of reform is narrowing in the DRC at present, and corruption is increasing ahead of these national elections that are constitutionally supposed to take place next year. And combined with that, some major U.S. companies are not nearly as engaged in this issue as they need to be. Also, the progress at pilot mines is not yet widespread. Congress can play a key role to spark industry and move more robustly on cobalt supply chains, and to urge the Biden administration to focus on combating corruption in the DRC mining sector. What allows these abuses to continue is actually a highly functional kleptocratic system, as Hervé very well noted. It's very functional for ruling elites and their commercial partners, which we've heard a lot about, to thrive while leaving the population continue to suffer from abysmal security, healthcare, and educational services. This is, as we call it the Century, a system of state capture, in which ruling networks and commercial partners hijack governing institutions and maintain impunity in order to continue to extract resources and secure the regime. This kleptocratic system needs to be attacked directly. Let me just say a quick word about cobalt. Cobalt gives batteries longer life, i.e., if you're driving an electric car, you can drive longer distances if cobalt is in your battery. The DRC produces some 60 to 70% of the world's cobalt. About 3/4 of that is produced by industrial mining companies, with the artisanal trade making up the rest. Part of the artisanal trade, as we've heard, is actually militarized, with Congolese army units known as the Republican Guard controlling certain mining areas, engaging in human rights abuses, and passing up illicit profits to corrupt politicians. Most cobalt is processed in China, which contains a slight majority of the world's cobalt smelters, but then most of it goes to the United States and Europe. Electric vehicles, for the first time, are now the main users of cobalt, and this is likely to continue to grow. There is an alternative battery, which contains lithium iron and phosphate, LFP. The driving range and battery life are not as good, but the technology is improving. But the reality is that cobalt is far from being phased out of batteries, and so companies have a responsibility to combat the abuses in cobalt supply chains. The electronics and automotive industries, as well as governments, have begun to work on this issue. Probably the most important step they've taken is to set up an industry auditing systems for smelters. And there are actually 44 smelters in that system, including 27 Chinese smelters. However, The Chinese Chamber of Commerce on Metals recently said that it was devising its own auditing program, which would be a major threat to progress on cobalt transparency, as it's very unlikely that a Chinese program would allow credible independent audits to take place. There have also been promising pilot programs at a handful of mines that actually have reduced child labor by up to 79%, and there are draft criteria for improving mine safety and labor conditions. But the main obstacle to all these issues is this kleptocratic system. Corrupt politicians and middlemen continue to generate illicit wealth. In Congo, the state auditor recently reported that $400 million went missing from the state-owned copper and cobalt company, Gécamine, last year. The DRC government continues to make non-transparent deals, such as a recent $2 billion deal with someone who's under U.S. sanctions for his involvement in corruption, Dan Gertler, and yet it hasn't published this deal. Accountability for corruption has also fallen by the wayside, as Hervé very well mentioned. Certain officials have been removed for their posts, but nothing has come of the investigations, and there are new players in the Tshisekedi circle allegedly involved in mineral smuggling or the fraudulent transfer of mining, oil, and even forestry concessions. And there has been no action taken since the publication of the significant corruption exposés of Congo holdup by the Sentry and several other organizations, including of a sitting government minister, Chinese middlemen, and presidential relatives. I just want to say a quick word about elections. One critically important way to combat the entire kleptocratic system and its consequence of child labor is through free and fair elections. Elections are, again, supposed to occur next year, but it's becoming increasingly clear that the vote will not happen on time unless there's much more pressure applied. Before I get to solutions, I just wanted to say one word about industry. What is needed most to overcome these obstacles of child labor and corruption in DRC is leadership from corporations that use cobalt, from the DRC government, of course, and from the US government as its highly influential partner. On the corporate side, no other company represents electric vehicles more iconically than Tesla. And yet, Tesla's leadership has been notoriously absent on the stage of cobalt and fighting child labor and corruption. Compare its actions for a moment to that of Intel, who was the first corporate leader in the fight against conflict minerals a decade ago, following congressional and activist pressure. In the early 2010s, Intel led an electronics industry working group to set up the first ever audits of the key choke point in conflict minerals supply chain, smelters. It mounted multiple high-level visits to China and other countries to get the tin, tantalum, and tungsten minerals industries on board, despite fierce resistance. Intel made the world's first validated conflict-free product by 2013 and ensured that 100% of its smelters were verifiably conflict-free, and Apple, Google, and others followed suit. Meanwhile, Tesla, which leads U.S. sales in electric cars by a 7-to-1 margin and is one of the biggest users of cobalt worldwide, has been absent on the child labor and corruption issue in that supply chain. Instead of tackling the problems head-on, the company's focus has been designing cobalt out of its supply chain, thus essentially avoiding the child labor and corruption issues altogether. In fact, Tesla announced it was partnering with mining giant Glencore to source cobalt directly, right at the time when Glencore was under investigation by the U.S. Department of Justice, the United Kingdom, Switzerland, and Canada for bribery and other illicit practices. Glencore later admitted to bribing in a U.S. DOJ deal a few months ago. Bloomberg even reported that sanctioned tycoon Gertler would benefit from this deal. It was shocking. Despite the massive known problems of cobalt and the hard work of the Industry Association Responsible Minerals Initiative on them, Tesla does not even sit on the association's steering committee. And despite the fact that several leading companies now source from 100% conflict-free smelters, Tesla is still stuck at 83%. Sure, Tesla has gone through the motions, contributing to various cobalt groups and being a member along with 462 other companies of this association, but its leadership has been notoriously absent. Of course, Tesla cannot solve the thorny problems of cobalt on its own. We also need stronger leadership from the United States and Congolese governments. But if we are actually to address this issue, all three must take on a greater role. Now on to the solutions. Number one is transparency. Transparency in the cobalt supply chain is a critically important ingredient for addressing the challenges. To that end, Congress should consider expanding the conflict minerals section of the Dodd-Frank bill, Section 1502, to include cobalt and or child labor, coupled with authorizing key artisanal mining livelihood support programs from USAID. Those tweaks alone would catalyze action. It would help drive best practices in industry, force companies to put more pressure on their suppliers to get all smelters audited, including the crude refiners based in the DRC that have very little transparency. The livelihoods piece would be a critical accompaniment to the legislation to promote responsible sourcing from the DRC. Industry must also tackle the major threat to transparency, Chinese smelters. Tesla, Apple, Google, and other key Cobalt using companies should send high-level representatives to China to negotiate an agreement with the key Chinese players on Cobalt, CCCMC, and the China Minmetals Corporation to create a credible electronics industry Chinese auditing program for all smelters. The companies should come to an agreement to have joint oversight over the audits, and that could be through sharing of auditors or ensuring that the Tech Association auditors are part of the CCCMC audits. This is possible. Third, electronics and automotive companies should use their supply chain leverage to increase contract transparency, which would significantly combat corruption. This would include obtaining and publishing beneficial ownership structures of mining companies, requiring cobalt producers to identify all contractors and subcontractors, and end-user companies should require mine operators to hire the majority of their Congolese workforce directly, not through subcontractors, as many Chinese companies have done. Secondly, the kleptocratic system in the DRC will continue indefinitely unless there are serious consequences for corrupt activities. The U.S. Department of the Treasury should build on its sanctions of Dan Gertler and Alan Gutz and investigate and sanction the international networks which facilitate corruption, including those identified in the recent Congo holdup and other reports, Chinese middlemen and companies, and even Western businessmen, as well as DRC officials. The U.S. government should also urge the DRC government to publish the recent Dan Gertler contract and open law enforcement investigations based on independent reports, such as the one from Congo holdup. Thirdly, there is an urgent need to get legal spaces for artisanal miners to work in the DRC. Otherwise, the corruption and human rights abuses will continue unabated. The U.S. Department of State and high-level representatives from Tesla and other companies should strongly encourage the DRC mining ministry to create many more artisanal mining zones, known as ZEAs, at cobalt mines, and take other key formalization steps, such as agreeing to a practical set of criteria for mine safety and rights that will be enforced, a standard for improving artisanal mining conditions. It will take creative initiatives here to work with the DRC government to overcome the corrupt interests, but again, with high-level representation, it's possible. Last but not least, the U.S. government, together with key European allies such as Belgium, should urge the DRC government to hold free, credible, and transparent elections on time. The U.S. Department of the Treasury, together with the EU, should sanction individuals who obstruct the democratic process, as well as strongly supporting Congolese civil society in civic education and electoral observation. I thank you for my time.
Thank you, Sasha, so very much for not just the testimony, but those very concrete recommendations for follow-up. I deeply appreciate it. I'd like to now turn the podium over to Ida Sawyer for such time as she may consume.
Thank you, Co-Chairs Smith and McGovern, for the invitation to speak today. This hearing is taking place at a critical moment for the Democratic Republic of Congo, amidst extreme violence in the northeast, escalating regional tensions with the resurgence of the M23, and as we approach the next national elections, which will be a critical test for the country's democratic trajectory. As other witnesses have described, child labor and other serious human rights abuses in the mining sector remain widespread, and these challenges only become harder to address amidst rampant corruption. I would like to speak about the broader human rights context in the country today, and the importance of supporting rule of law, accountability for past and recent crimes, and democratic governance to create the conditions necessary to effectively address child labor and other human rights violations. Many hoped that the situation in Congo would improve when President Tshisekedi came to power in January 2019, following a protracted political crisis as former President Kabila held on to power beyond the end of his constitutionally mandated two-term limit. But 3.5 years later, we have yet to see meaningful progress on human rights or the systemic reforms needed to finally break the cycles of violence, abuse, corruption, and impunity that have plagued the country for decades. The humanitarian and human rights situation across the country remains dire. Nearly 5.5 million people are displaced, and 1 in 3 people are facing severe or acute food insecurity. Some 120 armed groups are active in eastern Congo. The Allied Democratic Forces, the ADF, a Ugandan-led armed Islamist group with ties to ISIS, has been responsible for some of the deadliest attacks. And many of these groups, as well as their backers among the Congolese political and military elite, control lucrative mining resources, land, and taxation rackets. Many have also recruited children among their ranks. To address the insecurity, Congo's government declared a state of siege in Ituri and North Kivu provinces in May 2021, replacing civilian authorities with military and police officers, including those implicated in serious human rights violations. More than 1 year on, the security and humanitarian situation has only deteriorated. Over 2,500 civilians have been killed by armed groups and government forces in these 2 provinces since the state of siege began. Against this backdrop, the resurgence of the M23, a rebellion originally backed by Rwanda and responsible for widespread war crimes a decade ago, has made a bad situation even worse. Since M23 fighters took control of several towns and villages in June, they have resorted to some of the same brutal tactics, and there are growing indications that Rwanda may be supporting the M23 once again. Human Rights Watch has documented that M23 fighters deliberately killed at least 30 civilians in areas under their control since mid-June. Some were killed as they attempted to flee, while others were executed at close range. The failure to have held M23 commanders accountable for past war crimes has enabled them to commit new abuses today. The United States, under the leadership of the former Great Lakes Special Envoy Russ Feingold, played a critical role in ending the threat posed by the M23 in 2013, including by pressing Rwanda to cut its support to the group. But the M23's leaders remained at large, effectively shielded from justice by the Rwandan and Ugandan governments, even though many are on US and UN sanctions lists and wanted on Congolese arrest warrants. As in the past, competition over eastern Congo's lucrative resources and land may have played a role in the group's resurgence and the role of Rwanda. Ugandan interests are also at play, with its forces deployed in Congo to conduct operations against the ADF, and some allegations that Uganda may also be supporting the M23. Both Rwanda and Uganda have been scrambling to get economic deals with Tshisekedi's government to help secure their interest, and these 2 countries have a long history of backing abusive armed groups to gain control over resources in Congo, and those responsible have never been held to account. Without systemic reforms by the Congolese government and meaningful progress on accountability, it is likely that this cycle will continue, and eastern Congo will remain a battlefield for the region's political disputes, proxy wars, and efforts to control resources. Ensuring that the upcoming elections are timely and credible, and that the outcome reflects the will of the people, will also be critical. This is especially important after the last elections, when the results were the outcome of a backroom deal and not a reflection of which candidate won the most votes. Having leaders who are accountable to popular needs and demands and who are viewed as legitimate by the Congolese people could go a long way in empowering and emboldening them to implement the systemic reforms that are needed. The United States played a critical role in pressing Kabila to step down at the end of his mandate and in supporting the calls of Congolese demanding an end to his abusive and corrupt administration, including by imposing targeted sanctions. The US has also thrown its support behind President Tshisekedi since he came to power, despite the disputed election results. While Tshisekedi's administration made many promises of reform, there has been little action to show for it. Instead, it appears that many of the same corrupt and abusive practices and systems that characterized the Kabila administration have continued with new leaders at the helm. Repression against journalists, activists, government critics, and peaceful protesters has escalated over the past 2 years. Previous speakers have also referred to continued corruption in the mining sector. In eastern Congo, security forces in January of this year killed an activist from the Lucha youth movement who was peacefully protesting the state of siege, and over a dozen other youth activists who also protested the continued killings remain in detention today. Several journalists received threats after reporting that was deemed critical of the Tshisekedi administration. A human rights activist in Fungurume died in suspicious circumstances, and his body was brought to the morgue by police officers soon after he denounced the embezzlement of mining royalties. Police in Kinshasa violently dispersed an opposition sit-in calling for a consensus around the election law, injuring 20 protesters and arresting 6. This repression may very well worsen in the coming months, especially given the tensions around the upcoming electoral process, which others have described. Given this deteriorating situation and the potentially devastating consequences across Congo and the broader region if not checked, it is time for a new approach and high-level engagement from the U.S. government. This should include the appointment of a new, well-resourced Great Lakes Special Envoy to help lead and implement a new strategy to address the security, humanitarian, human rights, and corruption challenges facing Congo and the region. The U.S. should also take an unequivocal stance in support of free, fair, credible, and timely elections in Congo and provide significant financial and other support to international and national election observation missions. The U.S. should stand ready to call out any problems in the election process and reject any attempt to prevent people's votes from being counted. We hope that Congress will urge the Biden administration to maintain and expand the targeted sanctions regime against those individuals responsible for serious human rights abuses, including in the context of upcoming elections, as well as any senior officials from across the region found to be supporting the M23 or other abusive armed groups. Congress and the administration should speak out against the repression of activists, journalists, and protesters, and provide support to human rights groups, whistleblowers, and independent media outlets. We also urge you to call on President Tshisekedi's administration to make concrete public commitments and take action towards implementing systemic reforms, including an ambitious plan to close the impunity gap in the country, with a vetting mechanism for the security and intelligence services, an internationalized justice mechanism, and a comprehensive reparations program. The United States has significant leverage in Congo. That influence should now be used to demonstrate full support for the Congolese activists, victims of rights abuses and their families, and others who have sacrificed so much and waited for far too long to see justice and to live in a country where their fundamental rights are respected. Thank you.
Thank you so very much for your testimony. Thank you for reminding us of the importance of the Great Lakes Special Envoy. As you point out in your testimony, Russ Feingold played a critical role. I remember it so well with regards to M23, and you reminded us, and I think that was a very timely reminder, because we certainly do need to get that envoy filled. So thank you for that and all of your comments that you've made. You know, just without objection, I ask unanimous consent that the Economist article of July 5th, just a few days ago, How the World Depends on Small Cobalt Miners, be made a part of the record. And just they make a point that the ultimate prize is the cobalt that will be extracted from the rock. For decades unloved, cobalt is now at the heart of the green economy. It is an essential component of batteries, phones, laptops, electric cars. We're now the biggest source of demand. The authors of an IMF paper published last year predicted that consumption of cobalt would increase sixfold by 2050. Sixfold. So, you know, we need to be way ahead of making sure that any cobalt mining is free from child labor and from other egregious forms of exploitation, because it's going to happen. The Chinese see that, and that's, I think, one reason why they're moving so aggressively to take over these mines, especially in the DR Congo. If I could, you do mention in your testimony, you make a very strong point, Mr. Lesnev, about adding cobalt to Dodd-Frank and negotiating a credible auditing program. I think it's an outstanding suggestion that I think we need to take up. But you also point out that USAID ought to be working to help artisanal mining livelihoods support programs. Are we doing any of that now with USAID? But that's something that can be done administratively and should be done if it's not being done.
USAID, in my observation, has a responsible minerals trade program. They've been supporting particularly the artisanal gold sector to try to get that more formalized and so forth. I think that there are so many competing priorities at the moment, and so, you know, some special authorization or funding or direction from Congress can help with this initiative, particularly if that tweak is made to Dodd-Frank, which can be done either by Congress or the Secretary of State, actually, then there should be some specific funds allocated for support to artisanal cobalt livelihoods. But that's got to come, again, with some more pushes on the corruption side of things, because there's so many corrupt interests as well, too.
As some of you may know, I am the prime author of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000 and 4 other expansions and reauthorizations since, and take very seriously the TIP report and the designation of Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3, and watch list. I was shocked last year when DR Congo was upgraded to Tier 2 watch list. And I'm wondering, you know, given this trend line, which seems very serious, as you've also well documented, that tierage will be issued very shortly by the Department of State. Should DR Congo, be a Tier 3 country because of child labor and other issues that they're engaged in? Yes, Ms. Sawyer.
Thanks. I mean, I think as we've seen, there were commitments by the Tshisekedi administration, and I think a lot of promises, especially in his first year in office. But what we haven't seen is the follow-up and actual implementation of real reforms. And I think it's clear from all the testimonies today that these child labor and serious abuses against children and other forms of trafficking are continuing. And I think it's critical for the U.S. to wait until the actions are actually implemented and not just commitments.
Yeah, I appreciate that. You know, sometimes we have, in an anticipatory fashion, give upgrades to countries. I actually chaired 2 hearings during the Obama administration when they artificially inflated and you know, gave countries like Malaysia, Oman, and Cuba a passing grade when they did not deserve it. Even if you read the narrative in the TIP report itself, it led to the completely different conclusion. So sometimes it was done for other issues. In Cuba's sake, because I asked directly of spokesmen there, including John Kerry, at a full committee hearing, how could you do this? The folks at Reuters, they had 3 investigative journalists who came back and said the TIP people had said they should have been Tier 3, as well as the other 14 that were artificially inflated. You just can't do that. You just got to speak truth to power, and then what you do in terms of sanctioning is the prerogative of the executive branch. But don't get it wrong on calling out abusers when they're doing such terrible things to children and to women and others. So your thoughts on any of that, you know, please, if you would. Father Manani, you made a point that there's been formed, and you do make the link, and you say it, and others have said it too, about the killing and the warring and the conflict being so related to these minerals and these extractive industries that are so lucrative. And it seems to me, you know, when you're talking about such an increase in cobalt and other things, copper, as you mentioned, Mr. Ambassador, all of these things, it's only going to get worse unless there's a tourniquet put on this. And if you could speak to that, because it's not just that children are going into mines and getting cancer. I don't know what happens to those kids. You suggested, Father, that they die. You know, how old are these kids? The one report from that I just put into the record from The Economist says children as young as 7. I mean, that's an abomination that's being done. But you do make a point, Father, in your testimony that the church has formed CERN, the Episcopal Commission for Natural Resources. And when you issue reports, and each of the dioceses do, and you're steadfastly bringing forward this information and accurately, how is it received by the government? What do they do when you tell them this? And what do NGOs and others when they convey their findings as well? Is it said, oh, great, thank you very much, and it's thrown into the shredder? Or is any kind of action done on it? Because again, we in Congress have not paid enough attention to this, I don't think, and that goes for all of us, it goes for me as well. You know, I've been there, but, you know, we get distracted by horrible things happening in Ukraine, and, you know, it's the tyranny of the moment and the urgency of the moment rather than, you know, something that is ongoing and serious. So what do they do, Father, when the bishops and your investigators issue your reports, and how do you get the information? Do you actually go to the mines? How are you received? Do the Chinese tell you, or whoever's, you know, in proximity to these mines say you can't come here? Is there violence in acquiring that information for the investigators? If you could answer some of those questions, I'd appreciate it.
Yes, we are for particularly this report. We've worked with some of our colleagues who are in that regions and who are part of the CERN, the Episcopal Conference, Natural Resources Conference. So we sent people on the ground. So we collected data because we wanted to see clearly what was happening very far from big towns. So as far as how the government reacts, I'm not sure that we have a government that's able to react today. What happened in 2018, I had put in place a power that doesn't have enough legitimacy. Most of his effort is trying to make sure that they will have the second term, even if they are not very popular anymore. So the Bishop Conference, they've done what is possible to go to them and to submit reports, not only for undermining, but it's also in elections, preparation of elections, and but there is no one who will be was paying attention. We were hoping at the end that the visit of the Holy Father will help maybe to open a ground of discussions, but he didn't come. But the relation today between the Senko and the government, it is very, very bad. In fact, there is no talk because you go to the government people, you go to the leadership inside the country, they will hear what you say, but then they'll just ignore it. And so regarding to the question of human rights violations, I think it's becoming worse and worse, and we are fearing that it will become worse in coming days if we don't concentrate in what can make the difference. And for us, what can make the difference today, it is to be able to focus, to make sure that we don't live what we've lived in 2018. It is not acceptable to have a president anymore who is not elected by the people, because what happened after is that this guy will not have enough legitimacy to push an agenda, and then he doesn't have any power to change the situations. And then the situation is worse. So for me, the focus should not be the question on human rights violations, even if this for us it is something that we use to be able to speak and to address concrete matters. But I think we need a legitimate government, we need a functional government, and it can happen only if we have an election that is free and fair. So we know concretely that the next elections may be rigged also. That's why we are trying to call on the partners to put in place structures, a possibility of being able to monitor not only the day of elections, not only when the election is proclaimed, but from now when they are preparing all this setup. I think my colleague Hervé Diakese Kyungwe said enough on that, and I think the situation today it is very, very bad, and as the days are going on, it will be very bad for the country if we don't stop the consequences, what I call the consequences of a rigged elections in 2018. Thank you.
Father, and any of the panelists, what kind of cancers are children getting when they emerge from these tunnels and shafts that they go down? I mean, you did mention that some of them have died. Is there any chronicling of this loss of life and this debilitating among the children? Anybody? No? If you could, for the record, if somebody has any of that, that would be very, I think, helpful. You know, can I ask you, you know, and Ambassador Schultz, when I was in Kinshasa, one of the things that I noticed was a large group of Chinese, it looked like a chain gang, working on a huge project, and you mentioned the roads being less than stellar in terms of their ability to survive rain and other, but it looked like a chain gang, and I'm wondering if, you know, if the Chinese, not the Chinese, the African leaders are finally catching on that this is a very bad deal for them. They get short-term, almost like the mafia. They get a great deal of money and help, seemingly so. And then, as you pointed out, their debts are not forgiven, so they have to sell assets or convey assets over to the Chinese Communist Party. And I remember talking to one member of the parliament, the Congress in the House of Representatives in Kinshasa, who said that they would build roads so that they could be in proximity to minerals and goods so that they could lay claim to them. It wasn't that the road was being made for the Congolese, it was being made for them, always a selfish motive on the part of the Chinese Communist Party. And I'm just wondering, you know, and maybe, Hervé, you might be able to speak to that too. Are these African leaders getting it? Or is the level of corruption among a very tiny few so large that they're able to buy them off? And secondly, if you could, and anyone who wants to speak to this, the Americans who have sold mines, others who have sold mines, do the miners get a far worse situation, or is it the same when hands are changed and the Chinese now, Communist Party, runs those mines? I mean, is it worse off for the individual Congolese under Chinese leadership?
Thank you, sir. I hope that I have understood what you have said. I think to address this Chinese situation with our leadership, we can imagine what they are offering to the leadership. They are offering a way of dealing with opacity without human rights control, like in the Western. So they can deal as usual and nobody will speak something against them. It's the easy way. They are making money in opacity. And so the leadership, which hasn't a vision for the development of the country, they like this kind of deal because there is no traceability of what they are dealing in business, and also there is no ground of accountability. And this is very dangerous because that's what this kind of things is like a new way of colonization. You see, you have some local leadership who is working for his own sake, for the family, and for their own interest at the expense of all the population. And what is happening maybe is, I will put a link with what is our expectation. You see, in Congo, now we are just at the edge of losing hope in democracy. And maybe what this kind of deal is putting in the mind of people that there is no need of a government, there is no need of a state, because those who are coming in power, they are not thinking about the republic, they are not thinking about the government for the people. They are thinking about their own sake, and they are dealing with those who are coming with cash for looting our own resources for their own sake. And at the moment, it's increasing resentment and it's threatening unity among people. And most of our population, they are young and they cannot find job, even when they study. And most of them are living in rural places, and they don't have any hope. If they were in farm, or they have business for agriculture, and it come one day they found cobalt or some mineral, and Chinese coming there, the government will tell them to leave the place without even compensation. And then they will use, so now they are spoiled with their own places, and they don't have something to exchange for living. At that moment, those are becoming extremists, and they are using for other issues, and they are threatening the security of the country because the country doesn't protect them. And in fact, they are dealing with foreign people in order to spoil them, to threaten them. We told you like, what's happened. You can see Chinese citizens ordering to Congolese soldier, military official, to whip Congolese with whole impunity. So what we expect of this kind of situation, we need to save the future of the Congo. And what is happening is just like, I think, something, the part of the iceberg that you can see. But what is deeply inside is more threatening, and this is the last hope of election. It's the last hope of democracy and the last hope of the future of our country. We need to deal seriously with that issue.
Now, real quickly, but on the whippings that you mentioned in your testimony and again just now, is that commonplace? I mean, they put it online so people would see, and that has an impact too about this could happen to you. But I wonder if corporal punishment like that is something that's used, particularly against children and women.
Sir, can you speak slowly, because I couldn't get you. You were.
You mentioned the two people who were whipped, and you know, with the Chinese being a part of that to reprimand for whatever reason. Does it happen often?
What's happened to them?
No, does it happen to other people?
For sure, because what we have seen is because it was caught by video. But what is happening every day is this is the rule, because they are protected with army. You see, if you can see a foreign citizen ordering to a military, that you can whip a citizen of this country, and even the fact to think that he can do that, and he has already done that. You can see each day what is happening, where there is no option of even to catch the video, where in remote places where there is no other authority than them, what they could do, and what they are still doing now.
Thank you. Yes, Ambassador.
Oh. Chime in. I think that actually Hervé made a very, very important point, right? Because corruption is a big part of the story in Africa, you know, fueled by China, but it's not actually the most important part of the story. You know, for 20, 30 years, the Chinese and the Russians have been running around Africa telling African leaders, you can have your cake and you can eat it too. If you adopt our system, managed democracy and state capitalism, you can steal elections and you can steal money to your heart's content, and we'll protect you. And that actually has made, I think, a real inroads with the African elite. The one thing that I would say, and maybe this is special pleading since I was ambassador to Zambia, but I do think elections matter, and I think that the result in Zambia was a huge surprise to the Chinese and a very unwelcome surprise, and really that's what we need more of in Africa. We need free and fair elections with people who actually care about the country's development instead of their own pocketbook winning elections.
Congressman, you asked a question about what happens to the mines that sold by American companies to Chinese. Are the workers worse off? So I would like to highlight a recent study done by the corporate watchdog group called Rights and Accountability and Development. Perhaps this can be submitted for the record. And the unequivocal answer from the study was yes. Since, in particular, the Freeport-McMoRan mine was sold to a company called China Molybdenum Company, salaries have gone down by about 40% for Congolese, despite inflation everywhere happening, that they're hired through subcontractors. The report describes workers described a colonial era level of discrimination, being kicked, slapped, beaten with sticks, insulted, shouted at, or sometimes pulled around by their ear when they were not able to understand instructions in Mandarin. Health and safety standards have gone down significantly. So this is not a hopeless situation. I mean, these are the minerals going to our own companies, and this is where our own industry needs to take a more proactive role and say, hey, we're now aware of these abuses. We need to, you, the mining companies, need to change them or we'll stop sourcing from you.
And are the U.S. corporations adequately looking at their supply chains to ensure that this doesn't happen?
There's not nearly enough engagement on this.
Thanks, Congressman. Just going back to the question you asked about how can we end this link between conflict and minerals, especially in the East. And I think it's key that we need to see consequences for those who are profiting from abusive armed groups controlling these mineral resources. And until that happens, the system will just perpetuate. And I think we saw with Rwanda's support to the M23 a decade ago, when there was real pressure on Rwanda, the US and several European countries suspended military and other assistance to Rwanda. There was real pressure, and then they were forced to cut their support to the group. So it can show, and for nearly a decade, there wasn't an overt Rwandan-backed rebellion in Eastern Congo. I think similarly, we saw, leading up to the elections, the targeted sanctions that the US and the EU imposed on those close to Kabila responsible for the repression, undermining democracy, did eventually lead to Kabila agreeing to step down and organize elections. So that, again, I think shows that enforcing these consequences can make a difference in changing behavior. What we haven't seen is consequences against senior Congolese officials, military and political, who are supporting armed groups that are active in these mines or who are involved in all of the corruption and lack of transparency abuses against children working in the mines. But if we can push for consequences, accountability, I think that's where we'll start to see change.
Alderman Ani, I know wants to make a comment. Father?
Yes, I wanted just to share what I do. I run a department of research, and I'm finalizing now a research on the condition of work in Chinese companies. It is tremendous what you'll discover there. Many people, we are not at the end, but we are closing very, very soon. It's clear that the condition of workers with Chinese, it is something that people will discover later on, when these people will go back and people will die. This kind of work, the people, they don't have any contract. They work, they don't give contract to people, to Congolese people. They are employing the engineers. They are not true engineers. Those who are coming, most of them, they are not qualified, and the DRC government doesn't check if these people are qualified. The salaries are very, very low, and the possibility of increasing salary are not there. The work that I've been doing, it is very, very bad. So you can ask your question, how do they survive in this kind of situation, these Chinese? What is clear today, and I've been part of the research, and I've seen that they have good link with the hierarchy. They use corruption, they give money, they have the control of our political system. So when you go to complain to a minister or to another person who is in a position to defend workers, you'll find yourself in a position where you will not be considered, because the Chinese boss will come before you and we talk to the guy in position in the country. So there is this research has been done between ourselves, CEPAS, and the other social centers, research centers in Africa. So we have a group of people working in Angola. We have a group of people working in South Africa. And as far as I know, this research was funded by the U.S. Embassy in South Africa or something like that. So I think the report will come very soon, next, I think at the end of this month. But the situation is very, very bad in different areas, not only in mining, but in roads, in building and everything. So the Chinese, their modus operandi is clear. They have the control of the leadership. And when they have the control of the political leadership, then the population, they don't count. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Father. We're joined by one of my distinguished colleagues, Sheila Jackson-Lee. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Chairman. And this commission is so important to me in the issue of human rights that even as I'm on the floor voting, the screen shows me partly. I'm trying to get on the screen, but in any event, I wanted to at least have my voice heard. First of all, you have highlighted the enormity of the problem, the saturation of the Chinese in Africa beyond the DRC is atrocious, appalling, and destructive. They do not come from a democratic system. They have thousands, maybe millions of political prisoners incarcerated in China on the mainland. And they're carrying their same tactics, hard-edged tactics, brutal tactics here to the continent beyond the borders of the DRC. Number one. Number two, I just heard one of the witnesses characterize the difficulty of the military supporting gangs and others who are abusing the innocent civilians in this process of mining. That is, of course, a calamity and a crisis. I want to find solutions. We know that precious minerals and other natural resources are just abundant on the continent. The disaster is my pain, starting from my going to school in Ghana and Nigeria during my academic years, is the fact that those resources should be candidly used for the empowerment of the people, schools, hospitals, clean jobs, even in that era, housing, and obviously that has not been the case. So let me take what we have right now and ask 3 questions, specifically what the United States can do now, number one. Number two, what the sitting president now can do. And 3, what will it take? Because it's one election after another. I was in Kinshasa with Kabila's daddy. When he had come out of the bush, we met in a downstairs location that was dusty and dingy. And the delegation that met with him said, we, the United States, want to help you craft a constitution, and we can be very, very helpful to you. Unfortunately, our offer, to our sadness, was not taken. He was ultimately killed. His son came in, and we met him as well. So I'd like to think that at some point we have to try and change leaders, however they got there, that are there. So I'd be interested in first the ambassador answering those questions. And please know that I may be in and out, but I think I can sit for a moment before the next vote is called. Would you, Ambassador?
Sure, I'm happy to answer my thoughts on it anyway. So I think we just need to be, as a government and as a people, a lot more aggressive and a lot more combative, actually, in what we do in Africa. I made the allusion, I'm not sure how you quite do this, but we should find ways to encourage American companies to get into Africa and to stay in Africa. And I thought the Freeport-McMoran's an interesting sort of point. I mean, I don't know that anybody actually sat down with them before they left the DRC and said, you know, we would actually prefer as a government that you not leave, that you stay. And I think that would have been better for the DRC, it would have been better for the United States, it would have been better for Africa as a whole. So I don't know why that conversation never happened. I think that frankly, you know, we are kind of in a war with the Russians and the Chinese, you know, over influence in Africa, and we need to be more outspoken about calling them on the things that they do. When they steal elections, when they, set up these debt traps and burden countries with debt that they can never hope to repay. I think these are all things we need to be much, much more outspoken on. I don't know if that answers all of your questions, but.
That includes having U.S. businesses that would come and stay and set the kinds of protocols and democratic examples and relationships with eliminating some level of work. I mean, I say work, workers, children, and work with others that are rightly able to, in being trained, do the job right. Would that be part of it?
Yeah, well, I mean, 30 plus years in the Foreign Service, my experience was, by and large, American companies are run better than certainly Chinese companies. They treat their workers better. They promote from within. I mean, they don't actually bring in lots of outsiders, lots of Americans to run the companies. They actually have, you know, locals
Right.
doing a lot of the work, and they train them and they promote them, and so I always thought that, you know, in many respects, American businesses are among the best ambassadors that the United States has overseas. You know, their business practices are something that African businesses should emulate. And, you know, I mean, again, I'll come back to the point I made, and I think some of my colleagues have alluded to it as well. You know, the Chinese business model is not good for your average African country. You know, there are no African workers working on these Chinese projects. So nobody's getting a salary from it. I mean, it's all Chinese sort of management that's running it. It's Chinese companies that are doing the work. That's not true when it's an American company. An American company that does a project on the ground in Africa, they hire Africans and they train Africans to do the work. So I think we should be much, much more aggressive about promoting American businesses overseas and in Africa in particular.
Quickly get Father, if you would answer, and then I am in the middle of votes. Can I have Mr. Kayunga answer what America can do, but what they can do with the government that is there right now? Father?
Thank you, madam. What I can say, I need to fix the context. You know, you have done more last time when we were fighting for alternance and democracy. And you have sanctioned most of our authority who were involved in the blockage of democracy and elections. And during the mass protest, most of our civil society activists died during the repression on the churches and so on. They were average of maximum 40 years old and 25. Most of them were young. They didn't want to become president or member of parliament, so on. They wanted only to have free and fair election and to trust for the best future on their country. But after the chaotic process of elections, we felt abandoned by USA because you started to fight with us, you put sanctions, and at the moment we have a chaotic result. And we felt abandoned. If you were so severe at that time, we didn't even have this hearing in that context because we are starting again what we could address seriously at that time. Anyway, I think in what we trust now, yeah, we need to sanction every authority which can be linked by stopping correct and free and fair or credible election. What will happen? Also, those who are involved, because these mining where children are laboring, the fact even you are in the USA, you know, it's a crime. It's under criminal law. You are lawmakers. So when it is this cobalt are exported and is now in business center, it's come even here to the USA. So it means that even your industry are using cobalt that come from mining where children are used, are exploited like slaves. So even for the respect of your own law, you are lawmakers, you need to reinforce it, and people must be prosecuted because they have to avoid. If they know now there are some sanctions, even they wanted to continue this business, they will not do it because children will not be abused again because they will not have somebody who will buy those cobalt coming from artisanal mines. So there are things you are able to stop even here. That was the sake of my presence here. We know that you have the power to stop it even by applying your own law, because it is you who are lawmakers about that. Thank you.
Father,
Say again?
can the father answer the question of what the U.S. can do now?
Yes, what the U.S. can do now, it's very clear for me. Please, with the and I repeat, with the president who is in place today, help him to organize a good election. Ask him not to try to go the way he is going today, organizing election that you want to control from the beginning to the end, and where is the only one controlling it, and where there is no participation of other political parties. Today, the setup of the elections is the fact that you don't have other actors, political parties, opposition political parties are not part of them. Even those who are in majority with the coalition today, they don't feel comfortable with the way it has been prepared today. So if you can help the current president, the current government in DRC to stop thinking that rigging of the election that the way forward, this will be very helpful for us. First. Second, today, the U.S. is almost absent from the scene of the DRC. We have the M23 that they started. We don't hear anything. We have chaos in business. We don't hear anything, and there is no special envoy. The ambassador has just left. Fortunately, I should say. We hope that the new ambassador will be someone representing truly the interests of the U.S. and will be on the side of local population. Third, what the U.S. can do is to support the effort of religious congregations, churches, civil society organizations that are fighting to help the country to stand up and to restart again. Thank you.
Sheila?
Yeah, let me just indicate that the landscape of the continent. So I do want to hear how the United States can be a asset to nations. But I do think in order to have order and human rights, there has to be stability and stable governments. We should not run away from that as well. And we should recognize what our basic core is. As the ambassador said, be aggressive in Africa. And get a lot done if we are encourage businesses, but never run away from our commitment to human rights. That's why we're here. But I think that if we are in Africa, if we stay in Africa, if we are part of the advocacy for human rights, if we fight for economic opportunities beyond the cities into the villages, and people who have to work in the areas can be working with dignity, rules, better quality of life. That's the fight that we should continue, because instability in Africa has also been its downfall. And when I say that, individual countries. So human rights is our message and mission. If we stay persistent in our support for these and stability in these various nations, the DRC as well. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you so very much, Sheila. And you'll be happy to know, Ambassador Schultz, Sheila and I were just in Birmingham, UK, for an OSCE Parliamentary Assembly, knowing of your past work with the OSCE itself. We were pretty much out of time because we had the room till 3 o'clock, but real quick, is the ILO doing enough on this, and the United Nations in general, to step in on this child labor exploitation and exploitation in general? Okay.
I haven't seen them play a prominent role on this, yeah. The last thing I may say, Congressman Smith, is
Yes.
just following up on several of the other comments that were made, is that the main reason that these abuses are continuing, whether it's the anti-democratic abuses, whether it's child labor, whether it's corruption, et cetera, is because people are making money on this. The same thing with the Rwanda and M23. And so to go back to the question, what is the number one thing the U.S. can do is to combat, that hand going into the cookie jar and, slap that down with real financial punishment. That makes a real difference. We know that those individuals like Gertler and Alan Gutz and others who were sanctioned by the United States, as well as networks of their companies, have really been hurting from that, and they've tried to maneuver and make secret deals, et cetera, but it's a big, big headache for them. But, as Hervé mentioned, the U.S. played a very prominent role in the lead up to the last election to even get there, and then we kind of backed off in many respects, and now is the time exactly to ramp that kind of a program up. It should be ratcheted, you start with the smaller fish and then, see who the bigger ones are, et cetera. But now is a really critical time, as well as to pressure on Rwanda. I would want to reinforce what Ida said in terms of the Rwandans. Was the U.S. vote to block the World Bank funding for Rwanda, which was critical, as well as Special Envoy Feingold's efforts to get them to back off the last time. This is something similar is going to happen again. Thanks.
And of course, we're all concerned about Election Day delays, as we saw with Kabila. That was in perpetuity for the longest time. And we did raise it on and over again here, called for sanctioning by the administration. And so we need to redouble our efforts. And I think the message that I would convey on behalf of my colleagues, that it is bipartisan, is that we're watching, we're going to be pushing. I love your idea, Sasha, of expanding the Dodd-Frank and trying to get USAID to even do more to help those who are suffering from this exploitation. We've had hearings in the past. We'll have more in the future, but we'll have legislation as well. And I'll just add, I'll never forget during the worst days of Darfur, talking to people who, including Ben Affleck, who actually had come here and testify, because he said everybody's overlooking DR Congo, where there's been more death and destruction than in Darfur, and that was horrible in and of itself. And he was right. So I think we need to refocus and become much more aggressive, especially since cobalt and other materials, commodities like that are going to be in greater need, and the engraved invitation for more exploitation is right there, out there. So we've got to, all of your testimonies were outstanding, and I thank you for them, and we will widely disseminate them to our colleagues, and we will act on them. And I thank you. Hearing's adjourned.